Chapter 1. The Archive of Life. In the fertile sheltered valley of Sparrow Creek, the town's most precious history was not kept in the church ledger or the county clerk's office. It was kept in a small sun-warmed shed behind a neat stone cottage stored in hundreds of meticulously labelled wooden boxes and small glass jars. This was the town's living archive, its promise of a future, its memory of the past. And its sole devoted keeper was Clara Thompson. At 68, Clara was a woman whose rhythms were dictated by the sun, the soil, and the patient, hopeful cycle of the seasons. Her hair, a soft and luminous silver, was usually pinned back in a practical bun that could not quite contain the wisps that escaped to frame her kind, weathered face. Her eyes, the deep, fertile brown of freshly turned earth, held a quiet, observant wisdom. Her hands, though gnarled with a touch of arthritis and stained by the earth, were instruments of profound creation. For 50 years since she was a young bride, learning at her husband Daniel's side, she had been the valley's seed keeper. She was more than a gardener. She was a librarian of life. She preserved the heirloom seeds that had sustained Sparrow Creek for generations, the homesteader's pride tomatoes that could weather a cool summer, the Abernathy gold corn with its unparalleled sweetness, the widow's comfort beans that could grow in the poorest soil. Each seed held a story, a history of droughts survived, of bumper crops celebrated, of families nourished. Clara's work was a sacred trust, a covenant with the past, and a gift to the future. Since Daniel's death from a sudden fever 5 years prior, her garden and her seeds had become her entire world. He had been the love of her life, a man whose laughter was as warm as the summer sun, and his absence was a permanent empty space in the garden of her heart. She lived a life of quiet, solitary purpose, finding companionship in the hum of the bees and the rustle of the cornstalks. She believed the great love story of her life was over, and she was content to be the quiet guardian of other smaller lives. She did not know that a stranger was coming to town, a man whose own life was a barren field, and that together they would face a storm that threatened to turn her entire valley to dust. Chapter 2. The Man with the Empty Hands. Elias Thorne arrived in Sparrow Creek not with a bang, but with the quiet, weary tread of a man who had walked too many hard miles. At 70, he was a man who seemed to be made of whipcord and silence. He was lean and tall, with hair the colour of sun-bleached granite, and eyes the startling pale blue of a distant sky. A long, thin scar cut a pale line from his right eyebrow to his cheekbone, a silent testament to a life lived on the sharp edge of the world. He was a retired Texas Ranger, a legend in some circles, a ghost in others. He had spent a lifetime chasing down the worst of men, his hands skilled with a gun, his mind sharp with tactics and survival. But the life had taken its toll. He had seen too much violence, too much darkness. After a final bloody confrontation that had left him wounded and his partner dead, he had laid down his badge, his heart, a landscape of ash and regret. He was seeking not adventure, but its opposite, a quiet place to live out his remaining years, a place where the only conflicts were with the weather and his own memories. He rented a small, neglected cabin at the very edge of town, a place with a leaky roof and a clear view of the mountains. He kept to himself, a solitary, watchful figure. He didn't engage in the town's easy gossip. His interactions were brief, polite, and functional. He was a man who knew how to build fences, both literal and metaphorical. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They saw the hard set of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, and they whispered that he was a man best left alone. Clara, from the sanctuary of her garden, would sometimes see him walking the perimeter of his property, his posture rigid, his hands empty, but held as if they still remembered the weight of a pistol. She saw not a dangerous man, but a profoundly lonely one. She saw a man whose inner soil was as parched and barren as the desert he had come from. Their two worlds, one teeming with life, the other stark with emptiness, existed side by side, separated by a fence and a lifetime of different choices. Their first real conversation was over a broken pump handle. The well at his cabin had ceased to function. Knowing of no blacksmith, he came reluctantly to the one person in town who seemed to know how things worked. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, rough from disuse. "The mayor said you might know a thing or two about mechanics." Clara wiped her earthy hands on her apron and looked at him, her gaze direct and unafraid. "Sometimes the problem isn't the machine, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice gentle. "Sometimes it's the source. Has the well gone dry?" It was a simple question, but it seemed to strike him with an unexpected force. He looked at this woman with her kind eyes and her dirt-stained hands, and for the first time in years, he felt the sharp, unfamiliar pang of something other than grief or vigilance. He had no answer for her. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Dust. The problem, it turned out, was indeed the source. It started slowly. A spring that had always run clear was reduced to a trickle. The river that flowed through the valley grew shallow and sluggish. The usual summer rains never came. A deep, relentless drought began to settle over Sparrow Creek, a suffocating blanket of heat and dust. The vibrant green of the valley began to fade to a brittle, dusty brown. The farmers' crops withered in the fields. The cattle grew thin. A quiet, desperate panic began to take hold of the town. Prayers for rain went unanswered. The sky remained a merciless, cloudless blue. Clara's garden, the one she had nurtured for 50 years, began to suffer. She used her well water sparingly, her heart aching with every bucket she drew. She watched as some of her more delicate plants shriveled and died. But her heirloom varieties, the ones bred for generations in this very valley, held on with a stubborn, deep-rooted tenacity. Her widow's comfort beans still produced. Her Abernathy gold corn stood tall, though its leaves were curled and dry. Her collection of seeds, once a beloved hobby and a tribute to the past, suddenly became the valley's most precious resource. It was the only hope for a future. Elias, from his silent cabin, watched the valley die. He had seen drought before in the harsh lands of the Texas Panhandle. He knew its brutal arithmetic. He watched Clara, saw her toiling in her garden from dawn until dusk, saw the quiet, fierce determination in her posture. He, a man who had always been a protector of people, found himself strangely moved by this woman's fight to protect a patch of earth. He began without a word to help. He would find her well bucket full in the morning, his own water ration shared in the dead of night. He used his ranger's skills to track and find a small hidden seep high in the hills, and he would carry back heavy buckets of water for her most precious plants. He fixed the loose gate on her garden fence. They were small, silent offerings, the only language of care he knew. Clara would find the water or the mended fence, and she would say nothing. But she would leave a basket of fresh vegetables, or a jar of pickled beans on his porch. It was a quiet, respectful communion, a friendship blooming in the most barren of soils. Chapter 4. The Serpent in the Garden. Into this desperate, thirsty town came a man offering a miracle. His name was Alistair Sterling, a representative of the Prosperity Seed Company from back east. He was slick, charming and persuasive, dressed in a smart suit that seemed immune to the dust that coated everything else. He held a meeting in the town square, his voice a balm of hope to the frightened farmers. He spoke of a new scientifically developed seed, a miracle corn that he claimed was completely drought-resistant. He had sacks of it on his wagon. He wasn't selling it, not at first. He was offering it for free, a gesture of goodwill, he said. All he asked in return was a simple contract, giving his company the exclusive right to purchase any surplus grain the farmers produced at a guaranteed fair market price. It seemed too good to be true. To the desperate farmers, Sterling was a saviour. They lined up eager to sign his contracts and receive their sacks of miracle seeds. Only Clara was suspicious. She asked to see the seeds. Sterling, with a condescending smile, showed her a handful of perfectly uniform, almost plastic-looking kernels. They had none of the varied colour and shape of her own heirloom corn. "This is progress," Madame Sterling said to her. "The future of agriculture. Your charming local varieties simply cannot compete." Clara took a few kernels home. She knew seeds. She held them, felt them, even tasted one. There was something wrong. They felt sterile, lifeless. She spoke to Elias that evening, sharing her fears. "I've seen this before," he said, his face grim after listening to her description of the contract. "In the cattle business, they sell you a bull at a low price, but the contract says you have to sell all its calves back to them, and only them. It's not a partnership. It's a trap. It's a way to control the entire market." Clara's blood ran cold. It wasn't just about this year's crop. Sterling was trying to make the entire valley dependent on his company. If the farmers planted his corn, they wouldn't be able to save their own seed for the next year, as they had always done. And the miracle seeds, she suspected, were hybrids designed to produce one good crop, but their offspring would be weak or sterile. They would be trapped, forced to buy his seed at his price forever. He was not offering a miracle. He was selling them into slavery. "We have to warn them," she said, her voice fierce. "They won't listen to us," Elias said, his voice flat, with the cynicism of a man who had seen too much of human greed. "They are desperate. Sterling is selling them hope. All we have is a suspicion. Then we must find proof." Clara declared, her quiet strength solidifying into unshakable resolve. Chapter 5. The Ranger's Craft. The quiet tinsmith's workshop had become the tinsmith's archive. The quiet seed keeper's shed became a laboratory. And the retired Texas Ranger, for the first time in years, felt the old familiar hum of the hunt. Their alliance was forged in the dusty heat. Clara, with her deep knowledge, began a series of experiments. She tried to sprout Sterling seeds using her best soil and her precious water. As she suspected, they grew, but the seedlings were weak, anemic-looking things. Elias, meanwhile, used his own set of skills. He was a master of observation and infiltration. He would drift into the saloon, a quiet, unnoticed figure in the corner, and listen to Sterling's boasts to the young farmers. He noted the names of the banks Sterling mentioned, the shipping companies he used. At night, he would ride out to the small camp Sterling had set up outside of town and with a ghost's silence observed the comings and goings. He was not just a mender of things, he was a reader of men, and he read Alistair Sterling as a fraud. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Sterling's wagon drivers, a young man with a conscience, got drunk in the saloon and let slip to the bartender that the miracle corn they were delivering was the same sterile feed-grade corn they usually sold to large hog farms back east for pennies on the dollar. The bartender, a man whose own family farm was on the brink of ruin, went straight to Elias. Now, they had a witness. But it was still one man's word against a charming, powerful company. They needed something more. They needed undeniable proof. Elias knew the next step. It was dangerous, and it was a line he had sworn he would never cross again. He had to search Sterling's wagon. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he and Clara rode out to the camp. It was a strange and thrilling mission for the elderly seed keeper. She who had never done anything more daring than sneak a cutting from a neighbor's prize rosebush was now acting as a lookout while a retired Texas Ranger picked the lock on a charlatan's supply wagon. Inside, Elias found what he was looking for. Under a false bottom in a crate, he found Sterling's real ledgers. They detailed the entire scheme, the purchase of cheap sterile feed corn, the inflated claims of its properties, and most damningly, the predatory contracts designed to bankrupt the farmers and allow Sterling's company to buy up their land and water rights for a fraction of their worth. He was not just selling seeds, he was stealing a valley. They took one of the ledgers. They now had the proof. Chapter 6. The Town Meeting. The next day, Sterling, feeling confident, called a final town meeting. He was there to get the last of the farmers to sign his contracts. The meeting was held in the church, the air thick with desperation and the scent of dust. Sterling gave his final masterful speech, painting a beautiful picture of a prosperous future. The farmers were ready to sign. The mayor was about to give his official endorsement. Then the church doors opened. Clara Thompson and Elias Thorne walked in. They looked an unlikely pair, the gentle silver-haired seed keeper and the scarred, silent ex-ranger. "Before you sign those papers," Clara said, her voice ringing with a calm, clear authority that stunned the crowd into silence. "There is something you must know about the seeds Mr. Sterling is offering you." Sterling laughed. "And what would a gardener know of modern agricultural science? I know the difference between a seed that gives life and one that takes it away," Clara said. She explained what she had discovered, what she feared, that these seeds were a trap, a way to make them dependent, to steal their heritage of self-sufficiency. The farmers murmured, uncertain. It was her word against his. Then Elias stepped forward. He did not speak with passion. He spoke with the cold, hard facts of a lawman presenting evidence. He held up the ledger they had taken. "This is Mr. Sterling's private ledger," he said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. He read aloud the damning entries, the purchase of feed corn, the projected profits from foreclosures. He laid the scheme bare piece by irrefutable piece. The mood in the church turned from desperation to a cold, rising fury. The farmers looked from the ledger to Sterling's face, which had gone pale. The saviour was revealed to be a serpent. Sterling, trapped, tried to bluster his way out. "This is an outrage theft. This man is a known killer, a retired ranger with blood on his hands. Are you going to believe him over a respectable businessman?" A silence fell over the room. The farmers looked at Elias, at the scar on his face, at the hard life in his eyes. And then one of them, a young man named Tom Gable, stood up. "I'll tell you what I believe," Tom said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I believe in Mrs. Thompson. She gave my family the seeds that have fed us for 3 generations, and I believe in a man who stands with her. Mr. Thorne may have a past, but you, Mr. Sterling, you tried to steal our future." A roar of agreement went up from the crowd. Sterling, seeing the mob turn on him, fled the church. He was gone from town by nightfall, his wagon of false hope rattling behind him. Chapter 7. The rain. The town was saved from the trap, but they still faced the drought. The victory felt hollow. Despair once again began to settle over the valley. That night, Elias found Clara in her garden, standing amongst her struggling, thirsty plants, her face a mask of weary sorrow. "We won the battle, Elias," she said softly. "But I think we are about to lose the war." He stood beside her, his tall frame, a comforting presence in the twilight. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply stood with her, sharing the silence, sharing the grief for the dying land. "In my life," he said after a long time, "I have found that you can't force things. You can't force a river to change its course. You can't force a man to be good, and you can't force the sky to rain. All you can do is stand your ground, do what's right, and wait." He reached out and took her hand. It felt small and fragile in his own scarred one, and "it is better to wait with a friend," he added. As they stood there hand in hand, a strange thing happened. A single cool drop of water landed on Clara's cheek. She looked up. Another drop followed, and another. A soft, gentle rain began to fall, pattering on the dry leaves, sinking into the thirsty earth. It was not a deluge, not a violent storm, but a slow, steady, life-giving rain. The drought had broken. They stood together in the soft, blessed rain, not moving, simply letting it wash over them, washing away the dust, the fear, the long, lonely years. And in that moment, under the dark, weeping sky, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of rain, of earth, and of a hope that had been reborn. Chapter 8. Planting a future. The rain was the beginning. It replenished the wells, revived the crops, and restored the spirit of Sparrow Creek. The town, now united and wiser, came to Clara. They did not want a miracle from a stranger. They wanted the shared wisdom of their own community. With Clara's guidance and Elias's practical help, they established a community seed bank in the old schoolhouse, a permanent archive of the valley's heirloom treasures. They worked together to build a small reservoir high in the hills, a shared resource for the dry times to come. They had learned a hard lesson, but it had made them stronger. Elias did not leave. He had found his peace not in solitude, but in community. He sold his small, lonely cabin and bought a small plot of land next to Clara's. He did not build fences. He started a garden. He was a clumsy gardener at first. His large hands, so skilled with a gun and a hammer, were awkward with the delicate seedlings. Clara would come over in the evenings, her laughter like soft bells, as she showed him how to thin the carrots, how to tie up the tomatoes. Her garden and his, once separated by a fence, now flowed into one another, their borders indistinguishable. Their love was like their gardens, a quiet, steady, and nourishing thing. It was a love of shared chores and comfortable silences, of morning coffee and evening talks. It was the love of two people who had seen the worst of the world and had found in each other a quiet, resilient, and beautiful reason to hope. One morning, as they stood together looking out over their connected gardens, green and vibrant under the morning sun, Elias turned to her. "Clara," he said, his voice full of a quiet, profound emotion. "My whole life, my hands have been used for taking things, taking down men, taking away freedom. You taught them how to give life instead." He took her hand in his. "I have nothing grand to offer you, only a quiet life and a clumsy attempt at a garden. But I would be honored if you would share them with me." Clara looked at him, at this good, strong man who had come into her life like a harsh desert wind and had stayed to become a gentle, life-giving rain. Her heart felt as full and fertile as the rain-soaked earth. "Oh, Elias," she said, her smile as bright as the morning sun. "There is nothing in this world I would love more." In their small nook of the world, the seed keeper and the ranger, two souls who had thought their seasons of love were long past, had found a new, unexpected, and breathtakingly beautiful harvest.